Welcome to part 2 of examining the literacy standard and TPEs for SB 488 certification. I'm Nancy Brynelson, former special consultant to the Commission on Teacher Credentialing and currently statewide literacy co-director for the California Department of Education. In part 1, shared information about critical policies and documents that oversee literacy education in California. And we focused primarily on foundational skills and all of the requirements of SB 488 certification relative to foundational skills, both 3.2 and Table 3.1. Today, we're going to take a look at 2 additional areas. First of all, Table 4.1 for the strong literature, language, and comprehension component with a balance of oral and written language. Really, that is a focus on the role of meaning making, language development, and effective expression. Those 3 themes from the English Language Arts English Language Development Framework. After we look at these issues for Table 4.1, we'll go on to Table 5.1, where we will be looking at assessment and intervention. All right, with that, we will look at what you need to address relative to this area of a comprehensive literature, language, and literacy program. The standard itself has sections for each of the themes of the ELA-ELD framework, and the TPEs also have sections for each of these. And the first one is TPE 7.6, meaning making. Meaning making is comprehension. Certainly it's comprehension, reading comprehension as we think of it, but it's also comprehension or how we make meaning as we write, as we read, as we speak, and as we present, and as we're listening. So it is all of the acts of making meaning. You may recall from part 1 of this presentation that we have these themes to really bridge the 2 sets of standards that are addressed in the framework. The ELA literacy standards for students in kindergarten through grade 12 and the California ELD standards for students identified as English learners in kindergarten through grade 12. So the first TPE we're looking at here is 7.6, and the row on Table 4.1 relates to the issues of building prior knowledge, supporting students as they read complex texts, helping them to learn to question, and also posing questions to students. So it's both directions. Discussion of the text that students read, literal and inferential comprehension, which is really critical, and all of the higher order skills that are necessary as students navigate text across the disciplines. So it is not only literature, but it's also informational text in ELA and all of the other texts in subjects such as history, social science, science, mathematics, etc. The second part of that TPE is the reading, listening, speaking, writing, and viewing closely to draw evidence, ask and answer questions, and to support analysis of text. So for very young students, typically what you see in the standards for this would be, what are the details? what happened first and second, and, what does this make you think? And then moving into more advanced levels, we're drawing evidence and we are answering questions about arguments. You'll see here asking and answering questions as key activities for students at this level and with this TPE. So candidates really need to be prepared to teach lessons in which their students enact each of these. Moving on then to the next part of table 4.1, we're looking at language development. This is oral and written language development, having to do primarily with vocabulary knowledge and use, grammatical structures, and discourse level understanding. So we're talking everything from structures of sentences, how they're put together, and then how text is put together, those discourse level understandings. And in the framework, those sections within each of the grade level chapters address these topics. This TPE continues, includes environments that foster oral and written language development, and discipline-specific academic language. So how is it that we create an environment? How do candidates create this for their students and when they're new teachers that really encourages the development of their language and helps them develop the academic language needed to work in each of the disciplines? Students are in this case, supported in developing language through the creation of text. And when we say text, we mean not just a written text, but a spoken text. It could be a multimedia text. So it's really engaging students in creating writing, and as they begin to use technology according to the standards, to communicate their ideas about what they've been studying. And then finally, leveraging linguistic repertoires. So in this case, home languages and dialects, and encouraging translanguaging, which may mean that students sort of move fluidly from one language to the next, both of them being rich sources of information for them as they are learning content. So honoring those languages from home and dialects as they are building their language. So each of these 4 elements of the TPE 7.7 would be addressed on the table in terms of where they're introduced, how they're practiced, and then how they're assessed. And the last area in table 4.1 relates to the theme of effective expression. Now, effective expression is most closely thought of as writing, but it's also speaking and presenting. And there's a component here that really also relates to when students are listening and when they're reading and viewing, and that is they are analyzing text for how ideas are and details are expressed. They are determining what's been effective in the communication that the author has effected. So as they write, discuss, present, and use language conventions, and of course, language conventions, as we know, are everything from capitalization, punctuation, spelling, and all the things that are addressed in the language standards. There's a range of both formal and informal collaborative discussions that are frequent. and therefore various purposes, audiences, and contexts. We want to engage students with not only frequent discussions with their classmates and with teachers, but also extended discussions in which they're elaborating on one another's ideas and following, especially as they move through the grades, more formal protocols for how to have a discussion in which all voices are heard. The next piece of this is what we normally think of as the writing process. So all that is entailed in planning, developing, providing feedback to peers, revising, editing, and producing writing and oral presentations in various genres. Of course, again, as appropriate for their purpose, for their audience, and for their context. So we are moving from both informal communication to formal communication, in this case, in which students are really polishing what their either their presentation or their piece of writing might be. There are standards related to keyboarding, technology, and multimedia. And in fact, it's important that students become adept in keyboarding, and you'll find standards related to, how many pages of text can they produce in a setting. That doesn't kick in until a little bit later in the elementary grades, but also fluency in spelling and handwriting, and the need for students to be able to use their handwriting in such a way that it does not slow down their thinking process, that they could get their ideas on paper, and that their spelling eventually becomes automatic, and they can communicate their ideas without having to spend a great deal of thought. This is related in some ways to the text reading fluency that we looked at under foundational skills. But of course, we know this develops over time, and that is different for different ages and grade levels. And the standards, again, are your best source of what is appropriate at different grades. And the fourth point here really relates to children at the various stages of beginning handwriting, beginning letter formation and printing. And those early conventions of, and every sentence ends with punctuation, either a period or an exclamation point or a question mark. So that is, again, taught explicitly and directly to young children so that they develop fluency with that, and it doesn't hinder the production of writing and the thinking that they do through that as they progress through the grades. So that's a quick summary of those 3 TPEs and those expectations of candidates for what they know, what they understand about what's to be taught, and what they can do, how they teach these elements of literacy. What are some resources for you? The framework, of course, we would recommend that you take a look at for more information in each of these areas. Chapters 3 through 6, we suggest, because those cover the ranges from TK all the way through grade 8. For example, is TK through grade 1. Chapter 6 covers grades 6 through 8. So each of the chapters have an overview that addresses the span of grade levels, and then there's a section for each individual grade within that chapter. And I would encourage you to take a look at the sections for each of those themes that we just addressed: meaning making, language development, and effective expression. There are figures There are many snapshots of instruction, especially instruction that addresses different disciplines, and also vignettes, and those are longer pieces in the framework that will provide good information about the various themes that are emphasized within the vignettes. In addition, at the CDE, we recently completed a 9-part series on the framework, a series of webinars. And we encourage you to go to our playlist. It's all hyperlinked for you here. Sessions 4, 5, and 6 addressed language development, meaning making, and effective expression. And so for each of those webinars, we have the recording, the presentation slides, and the guidance documents that we looked at in part 1 that really give you chapter links, page numbers where different themes are addressed. Again, a nice guide to not only the framework, but other resources as well. I would also call your attention to the California Digital Learning Integration and Standards Guidance in Section C for ELA literacy and ELD. The chapter 11 addresses the cross-cutting themes of ELA literacy. So if that might be a nice summary of those themes for your candidates. In that chapter, there's a longer discussion of each of those themes within the framework itself in chapter 2. But what's nice about chapter 11 in section C of this other document is that it's confined to about 2 pages. In addition, chapters 12 through 15 have key standards and then related standards and instructional considerations for grades TK all the way through grade 8, organized in a similar fashion to the framework in terms of the 5 themes. So you will find in each of those chapters a section on meaning making, language development, and effective expression. And you get a chance to see how all of these themes work together, because there are standards that really cut across several of these themes. So those would be some resources that I would suggest you take a look at for more information. Another source would be the CTC resource for these 3 themes. This is the resource guide on preparing teachers for effective literacy instruction. And that document is similarly organized to the framework and to the digital learning and standards guidance document by theme. And so you will find on pages 30 through 46 a section for each of these 3 themes, meaning making, language development, and effective expression, that communicate what it is that students need to know. Therefore, these are things teachers need to know in order that students then at the K-12 level learn all of this content. So this is organized into various subcategories, but broad content, assessment and tiered instruction, comprehensive and integrated literacy, etc. So take a look at those for some additional information with references to various other documents that you'll find in that particular bibliography. That takes us to assessment and intervention. So this is table 5.1. And at this point, you're probably thinking, okay, we're getting close to the end of what you need to do for certification. This, in shorthand, assessment and intervention, or ongoing diagnostic techniques that inform teaching and assessment and early intervention techniques. In this area, there are really 2 TPEs that are addressed. TPE 7.2, which addresses UDL, or Universal Design for Learning, MTSS, or Multi-Tiered System of Support, and the dyslexia guidelines. UDL, as we all know, has been with us for many years, and probably CAST is our best source of information on UDL. But the overarching idea here is that we want all students to be successful from the beginning. And so we consider all the ways in which we organize instruction so that they are, in terms of how they express themselves, how they receive information, and how they are engaged and actively involved in their instruction in various ways. California's multi-tiered system of support, and we know it emerged out of work with response to intervention, and we are most familiar with designations of Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3. You may want to take a look at some of the information on MTSS that's now coming out of the Orange County Department of Education. They actually have the contract for the state for MTSS, and they really are reframing it a bit in terms of a continuum of support. And so the language that we're seeing more, and what's reflected in Standard 7 to, in large part, is universal support, or what I often refer to as first best instruction, supplemental support for students who, through their first instruction, are still needing some additional support, additional either time or instruction to, or time with instruction and practice in order to progress. And then students who really haven't benefited from their first instruction or that additional support that's been offered, and who may need intensified support. And more on that in a bit. But again, the framing is really about what is the continuum we're offering. And the other piece that I would add is that really the framework for MTSS includes not only academic support, but behavioral and other engagement of family and other issues in terms of the whole child. And then finally, in this TPE, the California Dyslexia Guidelines, specifically the definition, the characteristics of dyslexia, and what is structured literacy as it is described in the guidelines and as it is recommended for students who are diagnosed with dyslexia. Now, throughout the standard and the TPEs, we talk about not only students with dyslexia, but also students at risk for dyslexia. So, and as you may be aware, California is about to identify approved instruments for initial screening or universal screening of students for risk of reading difficulties, including dyslexia. And that work is expected to be completed by the end of December 2024. And shortly thereafter, school districts will be required to adopt one or more of those instruments to use for every child in kindergarten, first and second grade, beginning in the 25-26 school year. So we really are looking at the whole range of assessment and intervention along that continuum of support as we see under MTSS to ensure that all children become fully literate. Moving on then to the next TPE addressed in this particular table 5.1, and that is really related to assessment and intervention. So the first piece, the first row about progress monitoring formative assessment practices, ongoing monitoring of student progress, and diagnostic techniques. Now, very specific about the use of the word practices with regard to formative assessment, because formative assessment, as it's defined in Chapter 8 of the framework, is not a test. It's not an actual product. It is a practice, or it's a process of observing students, or maybe using things like exit tickets or other quick methods where students may be producing some writing or another artifact to give a teacher an in-the-moment assessment of their progress, as well as other methods of determining, perhaps it's a benchmark assessment, an end-of-unit assessment, or other diagnostic techniques where we're looking more specifically at an element of literacy in which we may have a concern or want to delve a bit more deeply. So candidates need to be familiar with these different types of assessment and some idea of how to use those with in their beginning stages as a teacher. Screening, as I've just described in the previous slide, really has to do with a very quick screening of students for potential risk of reading and writing difficulties, and perhaps to determine their literacy profile. So just sort of where are students, to get a sense of them. It's interesting that in the new education code and legislation related to screenings for California, school districts get to determine when these will take place. And so, and there's an indication that students should have had sufficient instruction for that screening to occur. So the expectation is that for kindergarten, that may not take place until perhaps mid-year. Although we do know that a number of students do come in having quite a bit of literacy knowledge and ability. So that's another area of assessment that candidates need to be familiar with, and that you will need to indicate on the table how it's introduced, how it's practiced, and how it's assessed. Moving on then to how we assess students who are identified as English learners and how we appropriately interpret their results. So, for instance, if a child is doing an oral reading, their accent should not be mistaken for, or the fact that they may pronounce a word differently should not be viewed as a potential error. So again, how one considers assessment and the results of assessment for students who have a home language other than English and are acquiring English as an additional language. And then finally in this TPE, intervention if indicated. If all of these other assessment results indicate that there may be some cause for concern and a possible need for intervention. As we described in the previous slide, there's sort of a midpoint for supplemental instruction that's really considered a classroom activity, could be supported by other professionals coming in to work with students. But, and then more intensified support may be something where a student is more formally identified. But that beginning with collaborating with families and guardians and other professionals, those are teachers, specialists, administrators, etc., for a comprehensive assessment of students' literacy progress and needs, both in English and, as appropriate, the home language. Then The provision of supplemental support, as we've been discussing, really an outgrowth of what's been happening in initial instruction in the classroom, and then possibly initiating referrals for intensified support. There's not an expectation here that brand new teachers are providing Tier 3 or intensified support for children who are identified as having dyslexia, although a great deal of what we do early on in our initial instruction and in our supplemental support may prevent students from developing what is later identified as a disability or dyslexia. So this is the focus here is on the team and how the entire system in the school, the comprehensive system of curriculum, instruction, assessment, and all the supports that come into play to support children in their learning. So, some resources for you as you're thinking about completing both tables 4.1 and 4.5 and 5.1. So specific to table 5.1 for assessment and intervention, highly recommend chapter 8. It is a nice summary of assessment across everything from the most informal to formal state mandated assessments and everything in between. There's also session 8 of the webinar series, where you'll find the webinar recording, the presentation, and the assessment and intervention guidance. That's the document that identifies sections in the framework and in other documents that address both assessment and intervention. And I would suggest that you look for the sections on that particular document and in the framework that are titled Supporting Students Strategically. In addition, California has 2 important documents: the California Practitioner's Guide for Educating English Learners with Disabilities. That was a response to legislation, and it really addresses everything from assessment to teaching strategies, monitoring of progress, connection with special education, etc. So that is an important document to consider, particularly with regard to that piece of the TPE that addresses English learners. And then, of course, we know that you need to specifically address the dyslexia guidelines within teacher preparation and within SB 488 certifications. But in this case, looking to those sections in the guidelines that address assessment and then intervention or teaching structured literacy, as we discussed earlier. There are other resources. There are lots of them. I'll just highlight a few for you. The Institute of Educational Sciences, which is a part of the U.S. Department of Education, publishes practice guides. You here, there's a newish one called Providing Reading Intervention for Students in Grades 4 through 9. And even though it says grades 4 through 9, really a lot of the advice there, and they've done real meta-analyses of the research relative to intervention across the whole range of reading, and has real implications for grades before 4 and after 9, but is a very helpful document. And then an older document, but still with lots of good advice, assisting students struggling with reading, the response to intervention and multi-tier intervention in the primary grades. Another resource that you may already know of, and that is the UC-CSU Collaborative for Neurodiversity and Learning. And they have developed e-learning modules, and they do a lot of other work besides. However, the e-learning modules are free and self-paced. There are three that I would call your attention to: the Introduction to Dyslexia, Dyslexia and the Brain, and Screening and Assessment for Dyslexia. These are great e-learning modules that your candidates could use or that you could incorporate within your coursework in class time. And then you may not be aware of something that was funded through the Reading Instruction and Intervention Grant called Project Arise. They have created a number of free online courses. Two of them that I highlight for you here: Intensive Intervention and Data-Based Individualization, that was actually created in partnership with the National Center on Intensive Intervention. And then there is another module on executive functions and literacy from the Center for Whole Child Education. They also have modules on foundational skills and on reading comprehension. So, and literacy as equity. So I'd take a look at some of those. Again, great resources for your own courses and for your candidates. We looked at this document before. The resource guide on preparing teachers for effective literacy instruction. And you may have noted in some of the other sections that we highlighted for you that within each of the themes, we have identified really content that candidates should know and be able to do based on what it is that K-12 students need to learn. And these subsections for assessment and tiered instruction. So you may want to take a look at these for each of the different themes in this document, which is posted to the CTC website and linked here. That brings us to the end of our overview of the actual content that you need to address as you describe or link to syllabi or assignments, to where you introduce and have candidates practice, and where you assess candidates' understanding and ability to use each of these topics. This is a slide that we looked at in part one, but I thought it was worth looking at again in terms of some considerations for completing these tables. First of all, that you need to be specific enough to address each row or each concept within the various TPEs that are identified for these tables. So it really needs to be clear to the reviewer that it is something that introduces, for example, screening assessments as one example that we've just looked at. But also, not only is it a specific enough or a detailed enough grain size, but it's comprehensive enough when taken together and sufficient, so that when you look at all the, the I, P, and A examples, there's a complete picture, and that those examples illustrate the relationship of concepts to one another, how the pieces fit together, because these TPEs have been, split into individual sentences, and how coursework, clinical practice, all these opportunities for practice and assessment are structured and organized with an adequate amount of time. How many courses, how many weeks? Honestly, all that's required in literacy, I cannot imagine how it could be done. This is just me speaking, without 2 full courses in a sequence for teacher preparation, professional preparation for new teachers. In addition, opportunities for candidates to really see, experience, and practice how these concepts are taught explicitly, directly, and systematically. And then just good advice for writing any sort of document using the language that's contained in the standard. So the same terminology that you see in the standard and the TPEs in your explanation, so that it's easy for your reviewers to find and to connect to what it is that you are explaining in these tables for purposes of certification. And lastly, some other advice. Sometimes if it's not completely clear, or you're thinking, gosh, I wonder if this would be an appropriate assessment for this topic, I would suggest that you go from the TPE back to the standard itself. Review the standard, and I'm really looking at the second bullet here on this slide. Go back to the first one in a moment. So work backwards from the TPE sentences in each row to look at how they are contextualized within the full standard. It may give you a broader idea or a more complete picture of what might be appropriate in each case. Then go back to the TPEs again. The other piece of advice is to, one, look at the first 2 pages of Standard 7. Those are really an overview, and they really apply to all of the standard that follows, and they apply to all the TPEs. Likewise, TPE 7.1 is an important standard, and is aligned with those first couple of pages of Standard 7. So what's my basic advice? Don't get caught up in just being, only at the phrase or sentence level for each piece of each TPE element, but also go back to a bigger picture. And then, of course, review the related resource for topics that still may remain unclear. And then you always have office hours and important email addresses that you can direct your inquiries to. I hope that this 2-part series has been helpful to you in terms of completing SB 488 certification and in organizing your entire literacy program for your candidates, because all teachers need to be fully prepared to ensure that students in kindergarten through grade 12 become fully literate. Thank you for your time.